On this day, I like to take you back to the history, the documents that were written about the death of Christ, the earliest documents that were that recorded the death and the resurrection of Christ. Those days, the documents were called papyrus. Papyrus are the kind of documents that are mainly written on kind of a sheet. So those documents, those days, they were written down on these papyrus, and these papyrus were very expensive. But we must also remember Jesus spoke Aramaic, a kind of language closer to Hebrew. But then Greek being the lingua franca, that means the language that was used across the Roman Empire, because it was influenced by the Greek emperor before Roman emperor. That is the time Greek became a lingua franca across the Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East to some extent. So many of these papyrus were written in Greek language, particularly in Koine Greek. And the earliest document may be in Aramaic or in any other language that were copied into this papyrus. And many of these documents were discovered, particularly in Egypt, very recently as well. So I would like to take you through this journey of these earliest documents that were ever written about the death of Christ as we go through this week, the Passion Week, and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. One of the interesting stories about the death of Jesus Christ is these were also recorded outside the Christian document. The Flavius Josephus was a Jewish historian who might have lived between 37 to 100 AD, wrote about Jesus in his writings, Antiquities, the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, whose name was James. And he mentions in his writings. And then he also mentions, now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it is lawful to call him a man, he was the Christ, right? Wrote Josephus. It's important for us to realize these documents were found later, very well later. So what you see here as these documents, these were all copies of later manuscripts, and Josephus' original manuscripts were not found. And in some manuscripts, they might have been interruption. But in spite of that, Flavius Josephus clearly mentions Jesus as a wise man, and he calls him the Christ. And it's important for us to realize the fact that it is outside Christian faith. He was a Jewish historian recording some of the historical facts and elements and events in his book. during those years. And then we also have Tacitus, and he mentioned Christ as from whom the name Christians had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. This confirms that Jesus was executed under Pilate during the Tiberius reign. This is his writings, and we have got some ancient form of his writings here, and he too lived in 56 to 120 AD. But again, this document is very, very uh, found very late in time, nearly 10th century or after. But then we also have other documents by Suetonius, and he mentions since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Christus, that is Christ, he expelled them from Rome. Christus is likely to refer to Christ. Possibly it may be referring to Christians or even Jesus directly. And he was from 69 to 122 AD. Pliny the Younger, and he described Christian worship practices. They were in habit of meeting on a certain fixed day to sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God. These are some of their writings I have got here. They are very important to follow up to find the documents that were written about Christ outside Christianity. But now we go into Christianity. This is one of the papyrus that we have, a very earliest papyrus, which is held in library, Manchester, John Ryland's library in Manchester. You can see how that is being kept. It's the smallest form. And it is written here, what it is written here, John chapter 18, 31 to 33. Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" That is what is the document mentioned here. This is kind of a lot of controversies about dating this document. This was purchased by Bernard from the Egyptian antiquities market. It was actually translated only in 1934 by Roberts. And so it was one of the earliest document of Christianity, John chapter 18, 31 to 33, and John chapter 18, 37 to 38. And they dated it either between 100 to 150 Christian era or 125 to 175 Christian era. This is important for people to recognize the fact that this is the closest document which actually was made as a copy to Egyptian Christians. So the original writing may be earlier than 100 CE. But let us take this as it is. It is 100 to 150 CE. That's a copied papyrus that we have here, which is quite interesting to find. And we can see that how close we can, even if it is like the crucifixion is like around 30 to 40. And then we have nearly 60 years later, these copies were discovered. And so the historical fact is that these documents recorded to many extent closer to these documents actually copied the original documents. They were closer to the historical events that happened at that time. So we move on to P52 to P90, the Gospel of John, which is again in Greek, and which is 1836 to 1907, and which is in second century, which you can read yourself in the gospel text. And these are the kind of papyrus that are found, and later on there were other papyrus and documents were available, and that filled in on the text together. And then we have here the papyrus 98. That's a Revelation 1:13 to 2, verse 1, which is quite interesting papyrus because this is also supposed to have been written nearly 100 to 200 CE. I use both AD and CE, means the same. They were discovered in Egypt. So you can imagine how these documents have been copied and were taken to Christians in Egypt, and they were kept somewhere. And that is where we get around 100 to 200 dated papyrus. And so the original document may have been earlier than that. And it's very interesting. Some of the earlier Christian bishops mention some of these writings in their own writings, particularly John's Gospel and others. And even the Romans, you can see Romans 5 was one of the earliest documents were found out here. And then we also have other documents that are here mentioning about the death of Christ and mention about Christ's teachings. Didache is the teachings of Christ, which is found to be one of the earliest documents in the Qumran community that the scrolls were found. And also we can say the Aramaic write-up here, Aramaic writings here, the Codex writings, which are also part of the gospel writings, and they are the earliest writings. And even we had non-canonical gospels, which were the earliest writings that were found in those kind of second century to third century CE Christian era. So we also have P46, which is Papyrus 46, which is talking about Second Corinthians, which they think is the earliest writings, even though it was the date is 175 and to 225. Or these documents were actually dated, the papyrus, but they were copied, and so this is written by Paul, and which is supposed to be one of the earliest letters around 46 to 56 CE Common Era. Paul must have written, but then the document is found as copied to other places. So P46, Papyrus 46, is the Second Corinthians 11:33 to 12:9, and you have these documents that were written about Jesus, and some of these writings are the earliest and closest to the dates of Jesus. And so what I like to highlight here is that we are talking about some historical foundation for what we believe. And these documents clearly show the existing of documents that were talking about Jesus as close as like 50, 60 years. And they were also copied, and they were written in Greek. So they were copied in Greek. That means some of the documents must be earlier than this, must have existed. And this is not a proof to something that we believe, but this is certainly that affirms that the death of Christ on the cross very much both canonical, non-canonical, and outside Christian writings very much mentioned closer to the dates within 50 to 60 years, even if we take the copied papyrus into account, must be closer than what it was. And so, in that sense, we have strong evidence of the suffering and death of Jesus uh, at that time, and his character as being a good rabbi and a teacher and the Lord, which are very clear. And this also makes us to think how the resurrection was very much captured by some of these writings. I will highlight how resurrection were captured by some of these papyrus in another video, and I hope this helps in many ways to develop the historical closeness to the historical person, Jesus. For us, it's important to get how these documents have been collected, have been molded, and we are not talking about uh, stories or myths here. We are talking about, to many extent, historical um, events and persons which are described by this document as close as 40, 50 years, even in copied format. Possibly the original documents were never found. And that is what I like to say on day on the Passion Sunday of Christ, that it is true that takes us through the historical machine back to Jesus to imagine the situation, how the Jesus took the cup of suffering for our sins, and on our behalf, he died on the cross, and he raised. He was raised on the third day, and that is the faith factor that we'll talk more. God bless. Bye.